His wolves found her at the tree line, with frost silvering her hair, and the forest already curling its roots toward her boots, like something asking permission to be touched, and the Alpha King, watching from his horse, with his breath fogging white in the dark, said the 6 words. He said to every trespasser before his men dragged them back across the boundary stones, to die of exposure rather than be killed inside the wood itself. No human survives this forest. Then the birches bent. Sorcha did not see them bend. She felt it, the canopy lowering around her in a long, unbroken ripple, branches dipping low enough to brush frost from her shoulders, the ground itself seeming to soften and rise to meet her next step before she took it. She had been walking for 6 days on a knee that had stopped reporting pain properly sometime around the 3rd, and she registered the forest's strange courtesy the way she registered everything else by then, distantly, as something that was probably going to kill her regardless of how politely it went about it. She kept walking, because the alternative was the men behind her, and she had already decided which death she preferred. Her hand was closed around the token at her collarbone. Iron-banded wood, no larger than a thumbnail, carved with a stag standing in a ring of thorn. Her mother had pressed it into her palm with the last of her strength, and told her to never cross into wolflands, and then had died before she could explain why, which meant Sorcha had spent 6 days walking directly into the one place she had been warned against, because House Belgrave was ash behind her, and the men who had burned it were the only thing left chasing her toward a decision. She had left with nothing else worth carrying. The granary ledgers she had kept for 9 years had burned with the rest of the haul. The boots on her feet had a split along the left seam that let the cold in with every second step, mended twice already with thread pulled from her own hem, because there had been no coin left for a cobbler and no time to find one. She had eaten the last of her bread on the 3rd day and had not eaten since, and somewhere around the 5th day her hunger had stopped registering as hunger and started registering as a kind of clarity. The particular sharpness that comes from a body that has decided survival is the only task left worth its attention. She did not think of herself as brave. She thought of herself as a woman who had run out of better options than the one in front of her, and who had learned, in childhood, to walk through fear instead of around it, because around it usually cost more time than she had. Behind her, 2 miles back and closing, were the men who had put House Belgrave to the torch on behalf of a border lord who wanted the land and had decided the easiest way to take it was to leave no one alive who could contest the boundary. She had heard their horses twice in the last hour. She did not look back to check whether they had heard her too. There was nothing behind her worth the time it would cost to look. The horses stopped at the boundary stones. The Alpha King did not. He came forward, alone, on foot, leaving 20 wolves and a warband's worth of silence behind him, and Sorcha had time to register the size of him. Not tall in the way that flatters a man in court, but built the way a door is built, something endispayed, before the trees beside her dipped their crowns toward him too. In a motion that was unmistakably different from the way they had bent for her. For her it had been a greeting. For him it looked, for one unguarded second, like recognition of someone they had been waiting on far longer than they had been waiting on her. No human survives this forest, he said again, closer now, and there was no performance in it. It was a fact he had watched prove itself true more times than he had patience left to count. I'd noticed, Sorcha said, that it seems to disagree with you. Something moved behind his eyes that she would not understand the size of for several more days. Iron grey, the colour of his irises in the low light, and they held on her face a half-second longer than a man dismissing a trespasser had any reason to. He did not kill her. He could not say why. Later, when his beta asked him directly, except that the wood had not stopped bending since she crossed the stones, and a king who killed what his own boundary refused to reject, was inviting a question he did not yet have the answer to. They did not put her in a cell. That alone told her something about how badly her arrival had broken whatever the order of things was supposed to be. They put her in a small stone room in the gatehouse, with a fire already lit, and a guard outside the door who did not know whether he was protecting the room or protecting the forest from whatever was inside it. A girl from the kitchens brought her bread and a bowl of barley broth before anyone had decided whether she was a prisoner or a guest, setting the tray down without being asked and without the careful blankness most of the keep staff had already adopted around her. "You looked like you hadn't eaten," the girl said, by way of explanation, when Sorcha only stared at the food. "Nobody told me not to feed you. I figured that meant I could." She left as quietly as she'd come, and Sorcha ate slowly, the way a body relearns food after going without, and found that the small, unremarked kindness of it sat heavier in her chest than the forest bending had. In the morning the Alpha King came himself, instead of sending someone which his beta, a sharp-eyed man named Joran, who introduced himself with the particular formality of someone deeply unsettled by his king's behavior, noted with a look that he did not bother to hide. "You're not from any house this side of the river," Garrick said. It wasn't a question. He had the look of a man cataloguing facts he intended to use, not a man making conversation. "House Belgrave," Sorcha said. "What's left of it?" which is me. And this she did not lift the token. She had already learned in one night that showing it too readily drew attention she could not yet survive. Belgrave fell 11 years ago. It fell again 3 weeks ago. Apparently it had more to lose than anyone remembered. He studied her in the particular way of a man who had spent a lifetime reading rooms and was now encountering someone who gave him almost nothing to read. The forest, he told her flatly, like a man reciting a fact he had repeated so many times it had stopped feeling strange in his mouth, did not respond to anyone. Not to him, not to his father, nor his father's father. It had not chosen, bent, opened, or acknowledged a single living person within his lifetime or his grandfather's, and an Alpha King who could not explain why his own land would not answer him, had learned, a long time ago, to stop asking the question out loud. "You crossed the boundary stones a beggar and a half-frozen trespasser," he said, "and it greeted you like you'd been expected." "I don't know what it expects of me. I didn't ask it to do anything." "No," he agreed. "That's what makes it worth investigating instead of killing you for it." The archivist's name was Auda Gramos, and she had outlived 3 Alpha Kings' worth of patience for ceremony, which meant she came into the gatehouse room without knocking, set the iron-banded token on the table with hands that shook faintly from age rather than fear, and looked at it the way a person looks at a debt finally come due. 297 years, she said. Sorcha did not understand yet what the number meant. Garrick, standing by the window with his arms crossed in a posture that did nothing to disguise how still he had gone, understood it immediately. "That's how long since the forest answered anyone," Auda said, not looking up from the token, turning it over with one knotted finger to trace the stag and the ring of thorn. 297 years since the last forest warden walked these boundaries, and the trees knew her by name, instead of merely tolerating her passage. She had a sigil cut into the gatestones at the heart of the wood. Stag thorn, same as this. And when she died without an heir, the wood went quiet, and stayed quiet, and every Alpha King since has managed the boundary as a soldier manages a wall. He doesn't understand. Because a woman who could read it left nothing behind but a mark on stone, and a story no one believed any more. She set the token down. "Where did you get this?" "My mother gave it to me. Before she died, she never explained it." "Your mother," Auda said slowly, "may not have known what she was carrying either. That happens when a bloodline runs that thin and that long. The knowledge dies, the blood doesn't." Sorcha sat with that the way she had sat with most things in the last 3 weeks, quietly, because falling apart had stopped being a thing she had time for. She noticed instead that Garrick had crossed the room without seeming to decide to, and that he had picked up a ledger off the table that listed the boundaries recorded incidents, going back 11 decades, and that he was reading the entries from her arrival, with an attention that had nothing to do with politics. You wrote 3 lines, correcting the watch report, he said, looking up. The timber count on the eastern stockade. It was wrong. You corrected it in the margin and didn't sign it. It was wrong, Sorcha said. I worked the granary stores for my house for 9 years. I notice when a count doesn't add. He read the correction again. She watched him do it. And something in his face did the thing faces do when a person decides, privately, and without announcing it, that someone is more interesting than they had budgeted for. How long were you walking? He asked her. The first question all day that wasn't strategic. Before you reached the stones. 6 days. Alone. There wasn't anyone left to walk with. He did not say anything to that. In the days that followed, while the court above her debated what to do with the fact of her, Sorcha learned the keep the way she had learned every place she had ever lived, by its edges first, the corridors no one used, the stairwells that creaked on the 4th step, the window in the gatehouse tower that looked out over the canopy, and showed her every morning the exact spot where the trees had bent for her that first night. The keep itself sat at the edge of the wood, the way the wood sat at the edge of everything else the Alpha King ruled, a border place, built for watching rather than comfort, its halls narrower and its fires smaller than the grandeur she had expected of a king's seat. As though generations of Alpha Kings had quietly understood that nothing built here was meant to be permanent, fog gathered at the lower windows most mornings, and did not burn off until well past noon. The staff spoke of the wood the way people speak of an old relative they have stopped expecting to change, with a familiarity that did not quite disguise how little they understood it. She found, in the particular hush of the place, something almost like the silence of her own burned-out hall, and did not examine too closely why that was a comfort rather than a grief. He set the ledger down, carefully, the way a man sets something down when he has run out of useful things to do with his hands, and for a moment the room held a silence that had nothing to do with rank in it at all. Then his fingers brushed hers, retrieving the token to hand back to her. Barely a second of contact, accidental in the way that 2 people standing near a small table will sometimes touch, and he withdrew his hand before either of them could decide what to make of it, and left without another word. She stood holding the token long after the door closed, and told herself the warmth in her palm was only from the fire. Joran found her in the gatehouse courtyard the next afternoon, arms crossed, blocking enough of the path that she understood she was meant to stop. "I don't know what you are," he said without preamble. "I've served him 11 years. I've never seen the wood so much as shiver for him, and you've had it bowing inside a week." He was not hostile, exactly. He was a man doing the job of being suspicious on his king's behalf, because his king, for the first time in 11 years, had stopped doing it for himself. If you're a trick someone's playing on him, I'll find out. I want you to know that now, plainly, so there's no confusion later about why I was watching. I'd think less of you if you weren't, Sorcha said. And something in Joran's face eased fractionally the particular respect of a man who had expected to be lied to, and instead been agreed with. The council pressure reached Garrick before it reached her, though she felt the shape of it second-hand in the way the lords who had once ignored her in corridors now studied her with open calculation. 3 of his eldest advisers petitioned him formally to have her removed from the keep, pending a full accounting of her claim, arguing that housing an unproven trespasser inside the walls while the wood's sudden behavior remained unexplained was an insult no ally would forgive and no enemy would fail to exploit. He refused them in council, in front of witnesses, in language flat enough that no one mistook it for indecision, and the cost of that refusal followed him out of the chamber, in the form of 2 lords who no longer met his eyes in the corridor afterward. He did not mention the cost to her. She heard of it from Auda, who delivered the information without comment, the way a person delivers a fact they expect to matter later. Cressida Marrow arrived 8 days later with a retinue large enough to be its own small army, and the first thing she said to anyone in the gatehouse courtyard was not a greeting, but a correction. Delivered to Joran in a voice pitched to carry, "I was told the forest had bent for a beggar girl from a dead house. I assumed the report was exaggerated for effect." "I see it was not." She did not look at Sorcha directly for the better part of an hour, When she finally did, it was the way a woman looks at an item on an inventory she had not expected to find misplaced. Her claim, when she stated it formally before the gathered court, was not cruel so much as it was airtight. 12 years prior, her house and Garrick's had sealed a pre-bond right, a formal witnessed agreement that she and the Alpha King would complete their bonding once the forest gave its blessing, as tradition required of any Alpha King's mate. The forest had given no blessing to her or to anyone for 297 years, and so the right had simply waited, unfulfilled but never voided, because no mechanism existed to void what the wood itself had not yet ruled on. My claim predates hers by 12 years and a formal seal, Cressida said, and there was no theatre in it, no raised voice, only the flat procedural certainty of a woman who had spent over a decade believing the waiting would eventually end in her favor. A trespasser's accident does not erase a witnessed contract. If the forest has finally chosen to answer, it should answer the claim that has stood the longest, not the one that arrived 6 days ago with frost in her hair and nothing to her name. It was not an unreasonable argument. That was what made it dangerous. Sorcha kept her hands flat and still against her thighs, a habit from a childhood that had taught her early that stillness read as composure, even when nothing inside her was still at all, and listened to a court she had no standing in debate the shape of her own future, without once asking what she wanted from it. She found out 3 days later from Joran, who told her with the particular discomfort of a man reporting something he had not been authorized to mention, that her quarters had been moved from the gatehouse to a chamber inside the keep proper, on the king's order, because the gatehouse guard rotation left her unwatched after dark, and the king had decided, quietly, without informing the steward why, framing it as a routine security correction for a person of unclear status, that this was unacceptable. He had spent 2 days arguing with his own counsel to get it approved without explaining his reasons, because the reasons did not survive being said aloud. She did not thank him for it. She did not think he wanted her to know. She saw him 3 evenings later through the half-open door of the small council chamber, alone after the lords had filed out, sitting with a single page of the boundary ledger in his hands, that he had not turned in the better part of an hour. He looked in that unwatched moment like a man managing the cost of managing everything, and she understood, watching him not move, not read, simply sit with the weight of a decision he had not yet found words for, that the composure she had taken for certainty, since the boundary stones was not certainty at all. It was discipline. It was costing him something every hour. She stood inside his walls being a question he could not yet answer. She did not go in. She carried the sight of him into the rest of the evening instead, unresolved the way she had learned to carry most things. He found her later that same night on the gatehouse stair. Neither of them quite able to say afterward why either had been there at that hour, and for a moment it seemed the evening might resolve itself into something neither of them had a name ready for. He had started to say something. She watched him gather the words, watched the rare effort it cost him to choose them. And she had leaned in without deciding to close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him in the cold stairwell. Close enough that whatever he had been about to say had clearly changed shape in his mouth. Joran's boots sounded on the stair below before either of them moved further, some matter of the eastern watch that could not wait for morning, and by the time the interruption had been dealt with, neither of them could find the thread of the sentence again. He looked at her a moment longer than the conversation required. She let him. Neither of them mentioned it again, though she thought of it twice the next day, at moments that had nothing to do with the stairwell at all. The corridor outside the great hall was crowded the next morning when Cressida's household guard, moving through on some errand of their own, closed around her in the press of bodies with a deliberateness that had nothing accidental in it, a hand on her arm that gripped too hard to be courtesy. A voice low enough not to carry telling her that beggars who overstayed welcomes in other women's houses sometimes found the forest less forgiving on the way out than it had been on the way in. She had time to register the threat clearly enough to be afraid of it before Garrick's arm came around her from behind, solid and immediate, pulling her back against him with a force that had nothing gentle in it and everything certain, and the guard who had gripped her arm released it as though the contact had burned him. He did not look down at her. She did not look up at him. The crowd thinned. The guards withdrew with the particular speed of men who had badly misjudged something, and when the corridor cleared, he released her without comment and stepped back to a correct formal distance, and she told herself the unsteadiness in her chest was only the crowd, and knew, even as she thought it, that it wasn't. He found Joren within the hour, and gave instructions in a voice low enough that Sorka, 2 corridors away, never heard a word of it. But the guard who had gripped her arm was gone from the keep by nightfall, sent back to Cressida's household with a message Joren would not repeat to anyone. And the household guard who remained gave Sorcha a wide and deliberate berth for the remainder of their stay. Cressida herself made no comment on the matter, publicly or privately, though Sorcha noticed she did not send that particular man's replacement anywhere near the gatehouse again. Cressida came to find her alone, the evening before the hearing, without retinue, without the formal blue and silver. And Sorcha understood from the absence of an audience that, whatever this was, it was not strategy. "I don't hate you," Cressida said, standing in the archive doorway with her arms crossed against a cold that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "I want you to understand that whatever happens tomorrow, I have spent 12 years being told to wait for a wood that never answered, by a court that stopped believing it ever would. And I built a life around that waiting, because it was the only claim I had. If the wood has finally chosen, it did not choose me. That isn't your doing. I know that. It doesn't make it easier to lose 12 years to a stranger who walked in 6 days ago, and didn't even know what she was carrying." She did not wait for a response. She left before Sorcha could decide whether comfort would be welcome or simply one more insult, and Sorcha sat a long while afterward, turning the token over in her hands, understanding for the first time that tomorrow's hearing would not have a villain in it. Only 2 women who had each lost something neither of them had chosen to risk. The hearing was held at the heart of the wood, at Auda's insistence, before the gate stones where the old warden's sigil had been cut 297 years before anyone in the gathered crowd was born. The clearing had not held a court in living memory. Lords who had spent their entire careers inside the certainty of stone corridors found themselves unsettled by open sky and old trees, and the particular silence of a place that had outlasted every one of their titles. Cressida's household stood arranged on one side of the gate stones in formal blue and silver. Her retinue's discipline acquired rebuke to the comparatively threadbare cloak Sorka wore, on loan from the gatehouse stores, because she still owned nothing of her own beyond the token at her throat. Cressida's contract was real. Sorcha's blood was unproven. The court that assembled in the clearing, lords, elders, the loyal Beta, standing close enough to his king to intervene if the temperature of the room required it, had no precedent for weighing one against the other, and for the better part of an hour it seemed entirely possible that procedure alone would decide it. That a witnessed seal 12 years old would outweigh a token a dead woman had pressed into her daughter's hand with no explanation at all. "A forged trinket," Cressida said, when Order set the token on the flat stone beside the carved sigil for the court to compare. "Proves nothing but that someone, at some point, knew how to carve wood." "Then let the wood decide," Auda said, "as it always has." Sorcha stepped forward before anyone could stop her, before she had fully decided to, and pressed the token flat against the cold stone where the stag and the thorn had been cut nearly 3 centuries before. And for one unbearable second, nothing happened at all, the clearing holding its breath. Cressida's expression sliding from contempt toward something closer to relief. Garrick's jaw set in a way that told Sorcha he had already begun preparing for the answer he did not want. Then the wood answered. It was not subtle. The canopy across the entire clearing dropped in a single continuous wave, branches lowering until leaves brushed the heads of lords who had to duck to avoid them, roots breaking the surface of the path in slow, deliberate arcs that curled toward the stone, where her hands still rested, and somewhere above them a sound moved through the wood that was not wind. That had never been wind. A long, low, settling exhale from something that had been holding its breath for 297 years, and had finally been answered. No one in the clearing spoke. Cressida's household guard had gone, still in the way men go, still around something they cannot fight. Cressida herself stood with her hand pressed flat against her own collarbone, the posture of a woman absorbing a loss too large to process standing up. And when she finally spoke, her voice had none of the procedural calm it had carried for 12 years. "I have given my house 12 years of waiting," she said, not to Sorcha, not even quite to Garrick, but to the clearing itself, to the wood that had finally chosen and had not chosen her. "I am owed something for that." "You are owed an honest release," Auda said, not unkindly, "which is more than most claims get." Cressida looked at the bent canopy a long moment, and at Garrick, who did not look away from her, who gave her the dignity of meeting her eyes even now, and something in her shoulders settled into a decision Sorcha understood, without being told, the decision of a woman choosing to leave intact rather than be carried out. "Then I withdraw the claim," she said, "before the court forces the withdrawal and calls it mercy." She turned without waiting for a response, gathered her retinue with 2 words, and left the clearing the way she had entered it, upright, unbroken, defeated in the one way that left her able to walk out on her own legs. The court dispersed slowly, the way crowds do after witnessing something they will spend the rest of their lives describing badly to people who weren't there. The lords who had questioned her standing a week earlier found reasons to address her formally now, with a deference that came too quickly to be anything but self-preservation, and Sorcha understood, watching it happen, that this was simply how courts worked. They did not need to believe in a thing to bow to it, only to be convinced it could not be argued with. She found she did not much care which of the 2 had moved them. Auda gathered the token from the gate stone and pressed it back into her hand with both of her own, an old woman's grip, surprisingly strong. 297 years, she said again, quieter this time, is a very long time to wait for someone worth the waiting. Don't let them make you small again now that they've decided to notice you. Garrick found her at the edge of the clearing afterward, where she had retreated to put her back against a tree that had, an hour before, bent itself nearly double for her, and now stood ordinary and still, as if it had never moved at all. He did not say anything at first. He put his forehead against hers instead. No warning, no question, simply the weight of a man setting something down he had been carrying since the boundary stones, and she felt him exhale slow and deliberate, the way a person exhales when they have spent 297 years' worth of inherited certainty discovering it could still be wrong about her, and had not been. She did not move. She put her hand flat against his chest, more to steady herself than him, and felt his heartbeat under her palm faster than the stillness of his posture had any right to suggest. "You knew before I did," she said finally, "what I was." "I knew the wood had never bent for anyone in my lifetime," he said. "I didn't know what it meant until I watched you stop being a question I couldn't answer, and start being one I didn't want answered by anyone but you." It was not a declaration. It was the closest thing to one he had in him, and she understood, the way she had understood the watch ledger and the moved quarters and the arm around her in the corridor, that this was the shape his honesty took, not in speeches, but in the things he did and the few plain words he allowed himself after. They stood like that a long while, her hands still flat against his chest, the clearing emptying slowly around them until even Joran had withdrawn to a discreet distance that was none the less close enough to intervene, because 11 years of service had taught him exactly how far away was respectful and exactly how far was reckless. The cold had come in fully by the time either of them moved, the kind of clean, late autumn cold that smelled of wet bark and the last of the year's leaf fall, and she found she did not mind it, standing where she was. He walked her back to the keep himself, slower than either of them needed to go, and said almost nothing else the entire way, which she had learned by then to read as its own kind of speech. The Boundary Archive had a desk in it now that had not existed before her arrival, set into the alcove with the best light from the eastern window, and the token sat on a low shelf within reach of it, instead of hidden against her collarbone, because there was nothing left to hide it from. 6 weeks had taught the keep an ordinary version of the impossible. The forest bent every morning when she walked the gate-stone path to check the boundary markers, the way it had bent the first night, except now no one in the courtyard so much as looked up from their work to watch it happen. It had become simply what the wood did when the warden walked through it. Her mornings had a shake now that they had not had since before House Belgrave fell, up before the rest of the keep. The gate-stone path under boots that were new and did not let the cold in anywhere, the long unhurried walk to the boundary markers with the canopy lowering around her the way it always did now. She still kept her hands flat, and still when something frightened her, she suspected she always would. But there was less lately. That frightened her enough to require it. Order had taken to spending her mornings in the archive too, teaching her to read the older boundary records in a hand half a dozen scribes out of date. And Joran had stopped addressing her with the careful neutrality of a man uncertain of her rank, and started arguing with her directly about timber counts, which she understood, from him, as the deepest form of respect available. Garrick came in the evenings, after the council business of the day had been settled, and sat in the chair across from her desk without being asked, reading whatever ledger she handed him. And some evenings they did not speak at all, and it was not an absence of anything. "You changed the gatehouse watch rotation the second week I was here," she said one such evening, not looking up from the page she was copying. "Before the hearing, before any of this was settled. I did. You never told me why." "I didn't like the idea of you walking back to that room alone after dark," he said. "It seemed worth correcting. That was 6 weeks ago." "I'm aware of that," he said. And there was nothing in his voice that needed to be aware of more than the fact itself, which was, she had learned precisely how he said the things that mattered most. She set the pen down. He reached across the narrow space between the desk and the chair, and found her hand without looking for it, the way a person finds something they have already memorized the location of, and she let her fingers close around his, and for a long moment neither of them said anything else, because there was nothing left that needed saying out loud. The kitchen girl who had brought her bread that first night now brought tea to the archive most evenings without being asked, and had taken lately to addressing her by a title Sorcha had not yet grown used to answering to. Joran still argued timber counts with her twice a week, and had stopped sometime in the last month, pretending the arguments were anything but his version of company. Order had begun, slowly and without ceremony, handing over the oldest of the boundary records, the ones that had not been read by anyone but her in 30 years. The way a person hands over something they have been keeping safe for someone they were not certain would ever arrive. Later, when the lamp had burned low and the archive had gone quiet around them, he kissed her once, careful, unhurried, like a man who had spent 297 years of inherited silence, learning exactly how not to rush the one thing he had finally been given permission to want. Outside the narrow window, in the dark beyond the keep, the forest stood still and ordinary, the way it always did now, the way a thing stands when it has finally stopped waiting. If a wood waited 297 years for the right person to walk through it, and bent itself nearly double the moment she finally did, what do you think it knew about her that no one else, not even she herself, had figured out yet?